Hello everyone, this is Dr. Willow Ariella coming to you to talk to you about social deviance and social problems. Sometimes seems like a heavy chapter. Anyway, there's a lot in this chapter, so I'm only going to cover some highlights that I hope you will find useful, helpful, informative. So let's get started. So in chapter 3, one of the things that the author discusses, and one of your discussion questions, is about social problems. So social problems, they are, they have different aspects. What makes up a social problem has different aspects to it. That's not very good grammar, but when sociologists think about what makes a social problem, there are different factors, variables, aspects to what defines something as a social problem. So the author discusses that the public must be concerned about it, so enough people must be concerned, enough people must be affected by something. It must be seen as a problem, or she says counterproductive for people in society, and it may help us in social, legal, in different ways, clarify some kind of issue. She also discusses morals and values. I encourage you to look up the word. Morals and values are not about rules or something like that. People tend to think morals is about rules. So I encourage you to look up those words so that you are clear about what they mean. Because she says social problems evoke a moral or value imperative. So what does that mean? Take a look at the definitions and see what you think she means by that issue. So social problems are defined by different people at different times and different places. She mentions that it's temporal and it's relative. So what can be considered a social problem in one year, decade, generation may not be considered a social problem in another one. As one example, she mentions a couple, but as one example, abortion has not always been considered a social problem. There's an interesting book that I encourage people to read who are interested in this topic by Gregory Pence. I think it's called Medical Ethics and I forget the title, but by Gregory Pence, P-E-N-C-E, and he discusses some of the history of abortion, and there have been plenty of times when it has not been a social problem in our globe, on our planet. She also mentions air and water pollution. So at some points we've had it, and there's been lots of it, but people didn't say anything about it, and now we've got a big concern about air and water pollution. So so there are different ways, domestic violence also was not considered a social problem in the United States until the 60s, and now that issue is spreading around the globe, and it was primarily due to feminists who identified it as a social problem and got enough people to also see that it's a social problem. So then the author discusses the different theories and how the major sociological theories. Understand that there are more theories in sociology, but these are 3 classic major ones that are introduced to people when they first start studying sociology, but they aren't the only ones. And so she goes through the different theories and how they kind of look at social problems. So she talks about functionalism and how the elite will tend to think that poor people are causing the problems in society, and so it, and how do you deal with that? How do functionalists deal with that? And it's still every social problem can be looked at through different lenses, and so functionalism looks at social problems through a particular lens of function, dysfunction, equilibrium, and things like that. And then the conflict perspective looks at power and control. A really good example of using the conflict perspective in society today is the Occupy Wall Street movement. So many people who are participating in that movement believe, feel, have the idea that the elite don't care anything about the poor people, and they think things need to change. The elite have caused so many problems in this country that they think there needs to be massive change in order for things to become less unequal, for people in power to not have as much power, or for people who have control to not have as much control. And so the conflict perspective usually comes into play, or is usually looked to analyze situations like protests and civil rights movements and things like that, because we do see such a difference in power and control, and elites being able to wield a lot of power and make changes. And so, of course, class is an issue, especially in conflict theory. So the classes and the lack of power that the lower and middle class are feeling right now, especially, but it happens periodically. It goes through cycles in different parts of the world. They are saying to the elite, the wealthy, you need to pay attention to us and do something about these inequalities. And then the symbolic interactionist perspective looks at how people think about things, how they label things, how they give meaning to things. And so what do people in different realms of society think about the issues that are going on that are considered social problems. And she talks about learning theory and labeling theory, and how people who are thinking about a situation really depends on how they define it. So she talks about the social construction of reality. And so symbolic interactionists take the perspective that people create the reality of anything around them because they are the ones thinking about it. And so they construct the reality, they construct the social reality around them based on the way they think about things, the way they talk about things, the way they define issues and situations. And so social interactionists tend to think that that's how things become social problems, is how people think and define them and label them. And so the different perspectives can help us understand why a problem becomes a social problem and why a problem is not a social problem, which is also really interesting. And so she goes into some different aspects too about some common social problems. And so you'll be taking one of those and analyzing it through the different perspectives, using the different theoretical perspectives. Why does rape exist? Well, a feminist would have a different perspective about rape than a functionalist would. And so it would be interesting to analyze the different social issues or social problems using these different lenses, because then you can see things from different perspectives and get a little broader view of any issue, but here we're talking about social problems. She goes into those in more detail. Just a moment, I'm getting to interesting discussion on criminals, who labels criminals, who defines who a criminal is, things like that, and how we dealing with perpetrators. I've been listening to a book called Incognito. I forget who the author is. Encourage you to listen to it if you get a chance, or read it. The author talks about how we currently deal with people who commit crimes, and he suggests, because he thinks that we don't have free will, and he explains it in more detail than I'm going to in this book and in this video, so if you have more interest in it, check it out. But he thinks because we don't have free will, and because genetics and environment both play very important roles in how people behave, how they act, how they think, why they do things, that we should have sentencing based more on each person. And so he is, I believe, advocating for a personal sentencing, a personally designed sentencing program, rehabilitation program for each person. Very interesting perspective. He's a neurologist, and so he's basing it on that idea. She talks about race, and race is a very important concept because it is so contested in our society. And so she says, and I want to reinforce, that race is a socially constructed category of people. Race is not biological. Race is a socially constructed category. People created, people who were slave owners, people who had their own prejudices and biases, people in power, they created these categories that then became kind of solidified in society. But race is not based on biology. Race is merely a category that people created to say that that person is Caucasian, that person is black, that person is African American, that person is Mexican, or whatever that is. But race has no basis in genetics. There's an interesting article that I share when I teach sociology that I'll try to find that talks about this in more detail. People who are Caucasian have much more variety in their genes than people who are short and tall. So it's really an interesting thing, and it's such a powerful concept in our society that it's really helpful if you take a look at it in a little more detail. And then she goes into minorities, stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination. That those are different concepts, and so it helps if you can see where they overlap or don't overlap. Can people stereotype and not be prejudiced? Can people be prejudiced but not discriminate? Can people discriminate but not be prejudiced or stereotyped? So it helps to kind of check those out and see what you think about those. And then she discusses anomie, which is a really well-worn subject in sociology, because that was a topic of Durkheim's, and he is a much-studied sociologist. But anomie, or people kind of feel isolated or and alone and not welcome in a situation. Mostly I wanted to pronounce that word for you, anomie. She gets into sex and gender inequality. I want to reinforce these two concepts, sex and gender, and she defines it, but I want to reinforce them. Unfortunately, people use the term sex and gender interchangeably, but sociologically as well as definitionally, they are different concepts. Sex is about biology. There are primarily two sexes. You can talk about others too, but for the purposes of this definition, Sex is about biology. We have two sexes, female and male. So sex is about biology. However, gender is a social construct. It is a concept. It is based on traits, values, and norms that people think are attributed to feminine and masculine behaviors, attitudes, roles. So there are not two genders because gender is based on traits, norms, values, behaviors. So gender is a social concept that we say, that people say, that person is behaving in a feminine way and that person is behaving in a masculine way. Oh, but that guy has a purse on his shoulder. That's a little bit feminine, don't you think? That's gender. That is about gender and gender roles, gender behaviors, gender norms, gender inequalities. So again, gender is a social construct. There are not two genders. There are gender behaviors, traits, norms, values, relates to feminine and masculinity. Sex is about biology, female and male. So I'm glad she mentioned that those are two separate concepts. I'm not sure why she talks about socialization, gender socialization, when that was in the last chapter, but anyway, there's a great video that I encourage you to check out. She mentions called Tough Guys. It's very interesting. It's a well-known video about the discussion by Jonathan Katz about gender and gender roles, gender inequality, and exploring how it is sometimes just as difficult for males as it is for females in our gendered world. And then, let's see, even though I'm skipping over the kind of gender topics that she talks about, it's one of my favorite areas, gender issues, sex issues. So I'm not skipping over them because I'm not interested, but just because I wanted to focus on some other things. She talks about, do women have equal rights? And I guess she's talking about this because many people think that inequality between women and men is still a social problem. So it's interesting that she's sharing, discussing that. She goes into theories around gender. So she talks about functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionist. And I really appreciate the symbolic interactionist approach in looking at issues around femininity and masculinity, because there are so many symbols, values, meanings that people have on interpersonal levels, and I think that's where change can primarily occur. And then she also talks about feminist theories, and feminist theories are often based on conflict theory, but with a focus on sex and gender. So she goes into social rankings, social class. It's interesting, you know, social class used to be a lot more talked about, discussed, analyzed back in the 70s, I guess, and now I don't hear the discussion as much, even though it's still a topic that people investigate. You know, people are talking about the 1% and 99% right now, and you know, is that accurate? Is that an accurate perspective of social class? You know, are the social classes really becoming that polarized? And so sociologists would look at that kind of issue and see if it's accurate, for one thing. And she talks about stratification and how there can be issues with that. Of course, poverty as a social problem. Poverty has been researched almost to death. People look at that topic a lot in you know, the field of social work, and some sociologists and some psychologists So, you know, it's really a highly, highly researched area, and all sorts of aspects have come out of the research on poverty. But then she goes into the relationship between social problems and deviant behavior. What is a deviant? Who is defined as a deviant? So she talks about that a little bit, and what isn't deviant. Why isn't something considered a deviant behavior? And again, this can change throughout the, you know, decades, generations, cycles in our history. Just like social problems can change, so can deviant, what's considered a deviant behavior. So she goes into different possible explanations of why we might have deviance, and the different ways to address deviant behavior. And this again is where the neurologist who wrote Incognito talks about how our approach to dealing with deviants or criminals right now is the sanctions that we are using are not very effective, and he thinks that there are other more effective methods of sanctioning or punishing criminals. And she talks about the 4 types of sanctions, and so mostly these are based on informal and formal. And you know, informal sanctions tend to be more are stronger than formal sanctions for most people. It's interesting, you know, here in Hawaii, this doesn't occur a lot, but I have heard of cases where, because for a lot of people who were born and raised in Hawaii, you know, we have a large, diverse culture, a lot of Japanese, Filipino, Portuguese, and Hawaiians, but because the family and because their community is so important to them, I've heard of instances where judges will apply informal sanction where a person who committed a crime will have to, and these aren't you know, serious felonious crimes, they're misdemeanors, but where they'll have to stand on a street corner and hold a sign that, you know, I committed this crime and I'm sorry, or something to that effect. And that's an informal sanction, and it can be very powerful for certain situations. And there's a long history in Hawaii of a strategy called ho'oponopono, where you work with your work with people who you may have committed a deviant act with, and that it also affects the greater community, and try to come to some way of resolving that, and a way to enforce a sanction on that person. And sometimes it can be in a way that's shaming, and shame is a big deal in society. And so is shame a powerful deterrent for you know, committing crimes or deviant behavior? And so, you know, it'd be interesting to look into that in more detail. You know, I have my thoughts about it, but, you know, I don't know as much about Hawaiian culture, as well as all of these other cultural and ethnic influences, to know how effective using that concept of shame really is in deterring deviant behavior. It might well be. So it'd be interesting to see. Okay, and so she goes into what I've already talked about, where deviance varies from time to time and place to place. Oh yeah, medicalization of deviant behavior. This is very interesting to me. There's a psychiatrist named Thomas Zaz, and I think it's S-Z-A-S-Z. I'll try to find a video for him. He is a psychiatrist who thinks that he's a libertarian psychiatrist, as far as I can tell, and he thinks that we, by committing people, take too much of their power away. And so he talks about this medicalization of deviant behavior in his books and research too. And so the author goes into different aspects of deviant behavior, including drug use, and certainly we're seeing a major societal change in marijuana use, and so people are trying to and starting to think about it differently, as maybe it's not a deviant behavior, and maybe it's not causing as many problems as people think. She talks about prostitution and sex trafficking and pornography, and I personally know some researchers who investigated these issues, and you know, there are very many perspectives on them, and you know, many feminists believe that you know, these are bad and they're bad for women and they're hurtful to women, and others take the view that for the most part everybody who's involved in these chooses it, and so it's a really you know, challenging area to come to some kind of agreement or consensus on, because people talk about these as victimless crimes, and you know, other people have other thoughts about that. So anyway, so those were some of the thoughts that I wanted to share. Some interesting things in this chapter, a lot of information, and things that I hope that you will reflect on. Use your outside readings that in the course guide to help you expand on the text information and learn some different views. Thank you for your time and attention to this video, and I will look forward to your discussions. Aloha.